The moment Iranian missiles and drones started crossing the sky toward Israel and toward U.S. military sites in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, the real story was not the attack itself. The real story was that the machine had reached the stage it always reaches. This was not chaos, it was sequence. When global debt closes the year at a record $348 trillion, when world military spending rises to about $2, $7 trillion when the Strait of Hormuz still carries roughly 20 million barrels of oil a day, and when nearly 40,000 U.S. troops remain spread across a region built on permanent tension, retaliation stops being a possibility and becomes a timetable. Reuters, SIPRI, EIA, and CFR all describe the pieces of that system separately. Put them together, and the ending stops looking mysterious. And that is the mistake most people make at the start. They think the missiles are the event. They are not. They are the confirmation. The event happened earlier, when the United States and Israel launched a strike that Reuters and AP say killed Iran's supreme leader and other senior figures, and when Washington accepted the logic that a regional order held together by bases, choke points, deterrence, and allied dependence could absorb one more shock without turning inward. It could not. Iran's response was the proof. Not proof that Iran is stronger than the United States. Proof that the outer ring can now hit back hard enough to make the center permanently reactive. That is a completely different kind of danger. Once that line is crossed, every base becomes both a shield and a hostage. Every ally becomes both an asset and an exposure. Every oil route becomes both a lifeline and a lever. Here is the pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A great power first builds a system of protection around trade, prestige, logistics, and influence. Then it expands that system faster than it expands resilience. More bases, more partners, more commitments, more places where backing down becomes politically impossible. Then comes the illusion. Silence gets misread as control. Fear gets misread as order. Delay gets misread as deterrence. Rivals study the network, learn its weak points, and wait. Then comes the reversal. A trigger event flips the system. The infrastructure that once projected stability begins importing danger. The perimeter stops protecting the center and starts transmitting cost back into it. That is the whole machine. Build, expand, misread, reverse. History repeats this too often to ignore. Athens did it. Britain did it. The Soviet Union did it. Different flags, different tools, same mechanism. Start with Athens, because the pattern appears there in almost laboratory form. After the Persian Wars, Athens built the Delian League, a coalition that was sold as collective security but increasingly behaved like empire. Tribute-funded fleets. Fleets secured trade and prestige. The longer this worked, the more Athens mistook maritime reach for political mastery. That was the foundation. Then came the expansion. In 415 BCE, Athens launched the Sicilian expedition, convinced that capturing Syracuse would break the strategic balance, enrich the empire, and create the conditions for victory over Sparta. On paper, it sounded rational. In reality, it was what overextended systems always call their final gamble. Necessity, not ambition. Necessity. That is how dangerous decisions are usually packaged right before they become irreversible. Then, reality refused the script. Command broke down. Alcibiades was recalled. Nicias hesitated. Syracuse resisted. Sparta intervened. The expedition bogged down, and Athens did what overstretched powers nearly always do when they receive a signal they do not want to hear. It sent more. More men, more ships, more commitment to rescue the original assumption from reality. But the problem was never just resources. The problem was misreading the map. Athens thought distance was manageable because its fleet was powerful. It did not understand that power projected too far eventually becomes power stranded. The expedition collapsed. Retreat came too late. Troops were trapped near the Asinaris. Survivors were captured or killed. Sicily did not stay in Sicily. The catastrophe returned home as weakened prestige, broken confidence, strategic exposure, and the beginning of imperial unraveling. That is the first lesson. Periphery is never just periphery once the system flips. It comes home. Now jump to Britain and the Suez crisis. Same machine, new century. Britain's imperial system depended on the canal not simply as infrastructure, but as psychology. The canal linked Britain to trade, oil, and the image of global command. London built a worldview around the assumption that this artery had to remain under imperial influence. Then came expansion beyond reality. Britain emerged from World War II, still armed, still proud, still global in posture, but financially weaker and increasingly dependent on the post-war dollar system. That is a dangerous condition for any great power, still strong enough to act, but no longer free enough to impose outcomes alone. Then, Nasser nationalized the canal in July 1956. Britain, France, and Israel moved toward force. The logic again sounded temporary and surgical. Restore order, protect the route, show resolve. But by the time a system reaches this point, force often reveals weakness instead of solving it. And that is exactly what happened. Britain did not lose Suez because it suddenly forgot how to fight. It lost because the architecture underneath British power had changed. The United States applied pressure. Financial stress mounted. Sterling came under strain. American leverage over the IMF mattered more than British willpower. That is the detail people miss when they look at decline only through military maps. Empires do not fail only when they run out of weapons. They fail when their external actions begin depending on financial permission they no longer fully control. Suez exposed that truth in public. The canal remained physically real, but the idea of independent British imperial command did not survive the crisis. The network turned. What had looked like control became dependency under pressure. Then comes the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Again, the same trap. Moscow built security through buffers, clients, and layered frontiers. A friendly regime on the border was not just a preference. It became part of the larger architecture of Soviet control. When Afghanistan destabilized after 1978, the Kremlin treated that instability not as a local problem, but as a breach in the whole security design. So in December 1979, Soviet troops entered to stabilize the client, replace leadership, and restore order. That is always the language. Stabilize, restore, prevent contagion. But those words usually hide a deeper fact. The center has lost the ability to tolerate ambiguity. It would rather buy certainty at a rising price than accept limits. And Afghanistan became the classic overextension wound. Soviet conventional power was overwhelming, but the resistance had terrain, time, sanctuary, and foreign backing. The war dragged, costs rose, air power met adaptation. Tactical superiority produced no decisive political solution. And that is the stage where great powers discover a humiliating law of history. Expensive tools can be bled out by cheaper persistence. The longer the Soviet Union remained, the more the war stopped being about Afghanistan and started becoming about what the war was doing to the Soviet system itself. Morale, economics, legitimacy, strategic confidence. Withdrawal came in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later. Afghanistan did not single-handedly destroy it, but it exposed and accelerated the internal weaknesses that were already there. Again, the frontier came home. Again, the machine reversed. Now bring that pattern directly into the present. The United States built an enormous military architecture across the Middle East. The Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, Al Udeid in Qatar, major facilities in Kuwait, assets in the UAE, and a wider network stretching across Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and beyond. CFR says Washington maintains facilities across at least 19 sites in the region. Reuters and other reporting put the U.S. troop presence at roughly 40,000. This system was built to secure shipping lanes, reassure partners, deter Iran, and preserve a favorable regional order. That is the foundation. Check. Then came the expansion. This architecture did not stay limited. It grew through the Gulf War, Iraq, the post-2003 occupation system, anti-ISIS deployments, Red Sea security operations, missile defense commitments, and the constant need to reassure allies while containing multiple threats at once. At first, that looked like flexibility, but expansion always has a hidden cost. Every new position creates another obligation. Every obligation creates another line that cannot easily be crossed without response. Every response creates another chance for escalation. CFR notes that U.S. facilities in the region were already being targeted by Iran-linked or Iran-aligned groups after October 2023. That means the network was already under pressure before this latest strike cycle. Stage 2 was not theoretical. It was already active, verified. Then came the misreading. The United States and Israel launched the strike that decapitated Iran's leadership, and Reuters reports that U.S. officials had already moved some aircraft and ships away from bases viewed as vulnerable to retaliation. That single detail says everything. A system that quietly repositions before impact is not operating from immunity. It is operating from awareness of exposure. That does not mean it is weak. It means it knows the network can hit, but it cannot sit safely after hitting. That is a much narrower kind of power than people admit. Stage 3. Undeniable. Then the reversal arrived. Iran fired missiles and drones not only toward Israel but toward the Gulf states that host U.S. military infrastructure. Reuters, AP, and regional reporting describe attacks or attempted attacks involving Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Jordan. The Pentagon said there were no U.S. deaths or injuries. Many people heard that and assumed the danger had passed. But strategically, that is the wrong reading. Casualties are not the only measure of a successful response. Sometimes the real success is proving access, proving reach, proving that your enemy must now think defensively across a much wider map. Once that happens, the network changes meaning. It is no longer just a tool of projection. It becomes a field of vulnerability. Stage 4. Check. And this is where the economic layer comes in, because modern conflicts do not stay military for long. The Strait of Hormuz still carries about 20 million barrels per day. roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. That means every escalation near that choke point touches energy pricing, shipping insurance, freight routes, inflation expectations, political sentiment, and financial markets. In older empires, the frontier often transmitted military cost back to the center slowly. In today's world, the transmission is almost immediate. A missile barrage in the Gulf is not just a battlefield event. It is an economic signal. It tells markets to reprice risk. It tells governments to prepare for fuel shocks. It tells voters that foreign strategy is about to show up in domestic cost of living. That is how Stage 4 spreads now, not only through casualties, but through price, nerves, and permanent alert. Verified. Look closely at the geography. Bahrain hosts the Fifth Fleet. Qatar hosts Al Udeid, the forward headquarters of CENTCOM. Kuwait remains a logistical hub. The UAE supports key air and naval functions. In peacetime, that looks like a sophisticated system of dispersed strength. In crisis, an adversary sees something else: multiple pressure points, multiple political seams, and multiple chances to force Washington to protect everything at once. And protecting everything at once is the fastest way to discover that a very large network can also be a very expensive trap. Check. That is why the most important thing to understand is this. Stage 4 does not begin when the first missile lands. It begins when the opponent realizes it does not need to destroy the network to destabilize it. It only needs to make defense permanent, expensive, and psychologically central. Athens learned that. Britain learned that. The Soviet Union learned that. And now the United States is learning the same lesson in a far more interconnected world. The question is no longer whether American power can strike. Of course it can. The question is whether the system around that power can absorb the consequences without turning every future move into a higher cost gamble. History's answer is severe, not forever, not at no price, not without compression. And that is why "this time is different" is the most dangerous sentence in geopolitics. American exceptionalism says no previous empire had this level of technology, finance, intelligence, and alliance depth. Modern optimism says markets will settle, diplomacy will catch up, and the network will stabilize. Tech determinism says better interception, better data, and better targeting will solve the problem. But none of those stories erase the core law. When a great power builds a vast security architecture, expands it faster than resilience, mistakes tension management for control, and then triggers a response that turns its own network into a field of exposure, the pattern does not disappear because the software is better. Tools change, structure remains. So what should the viewer take from this? Not panic, not fatalism, pattern recognition. Stop seeing these events as disconnected headlines. Start seeing the machine underneath them. Watch troop movements, watch carrier positioning, watch oil routes and insurance rates. Watch official language about restraint paired with quiet reinforcement. Watch how allies react when the bases on their soil stop feeling like insurance and start feeling like magnets. Those are the tells. Those are the fingerprints of a system moving from management to compulsion. And the final deception is that this phase can still look stable from a distance. No formal collapse. No single decisive defeat. Just a sequence of increasingly expensive, successful operations that solve less than they expose. That is how great powers drift into exhaustion in the modern world. Not with one dramatic ending, but with a growing inability to restore the old order at the old cost. So remember the formula. Build the network, expand the obligations, misread the silence, trigger the reversal. That is the sequence. That is the machine. And what happened when Iran struck back across the Middle East was not a detour from that pattern. It was the pattern announcing itself in public. The people who wait for the official declaration are always late. The people who study the structure see it earlier. And in moments like this, seeing it early is everything. If this breakdown sharpened the map for you, subscribe now. Because the next question is even bigger. How this military architecture was built, why choke points matter more than speeches, and what the next stage looks like if this escalation keeps climbing.